to be launching this wonderful conference. When Peter invited me to speak about, the utopian energies of 1989, my reaction was, well, finally, this is exactly what we should be talking about. So here we go. In the spring of 1988, I was 20 years old, a first-year student at Sofia University. A professor was an afternoon lecture. I remember it was a lecture in geopolitics. So my professor mentioned that people were gathering support or in protest of the pollution in a city on the Danube River. I was raised a good communist. So when I dutifully signed that petition, I felt I was fulfilling, my duties as a good comrade and a citizen. On the very next morning, the dean of my university called me up and said, Albena, you have signed up to a committee that doesn't have the blessing of the party. So we'll have to expel you unless, of course, you withdraw your signature. Although, you are one of our best students, that's how things go. This is how I inadvertently or unwittingly, without even meaning it, I became a dissident. The petition I had signed became the foundation of Ekoglasnost, now the Green Party. I neither withdrew my signature, nor was I expelled from the university, entirely within the logic of those times. But this is another story which I might tell you at the end of this conference over drinks. About 10 years ago, the files of the Bulgarian Secret Service became public, and I was not surprised actually to read about the following exchange between the Secret Service and the Central Committee of the party. The party asked whether we, the dissidents, were a serious threat to the regime, and the answer was no. They are all good communists. The revolutions of 1989 have now receded in the rear view of history. Our great emancipatory projects expired before it became truly historically exhausted. But our revolutions were pregnant with an idea, with some precious insight that is urgently needed today. And I'm here to tell you that story, that insight. I will first offer some reflections on the peculiarity of the current historical juncture, some reflection on what kind of political theory we need to do in order to respond to the emergencies of the day, and then try to recover some of the lost wisdom of 1989, wisdom whose time has come now. I propose to perform what Walter Benjamin called a profane illumination. Profane illumination. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this wonderful term. Benjamin meant this as a method of staring the catastrophes of the present in the face and seeing within them, perceiving within them, the outlines of a better world. The illumination is profane in a double sense, or at least this is how I've always understood it to be. It is not driven by a grand, sacrosanct utopia, but proceeds from an astute, careful or merciless descriptive understanding of the essential features of the world as it is. Second, this method of critique consists in grasping the contingency and even the absurdity of the supposedly unchallengeable logic that guides our thinking. So this is what I will attempt to do. Now, let us start from where we happen to be and scrutinize the political common sense of our time. We're on the verge of an epochal shift. On the one hand, the neoliberal social order is shaking. We hear that a lot. First, under the blows of the financial crisis of 10 years ago, and more recently of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, even if the neoliberal formula of free markets, globally integrated economies, cultural liberalism, and internationalism or cosmopolitanism is not completely gone, it is still there, the consensus that supported it, that gave it a sense of inevitability, of normality and durability, is no longer there. The space is now opening up for a novel or a brand new, maybe, if we wanted, socio-political form. Now, the popularity of three competing alternatives to neoliberalism is growing. Those are the post-war welfare state, socialism, and autocratic capitalism or illiberal democracy. On the other hand, so on the one hand, we have the growing popularity of these three alternatives to neoliberal capitalism. But on the other hand, there is also a widely acknowledged feeling or understanding that an effective reaction to the ecological disaster will require an unprecedented mobilization of resources, as we need to produce and consume our life differently. So we need to make that shift rather urgently, immediately. So by all evidence, we're in a moment that combines a sense of acute emergency and the active search for alternative socioeconomic scenarios. So far, so good. However, even as the understanding is there that such a radical shift is needed, and the moment for it is right now, neither the political will nor the intellectual energies are there for a radical transformative shift. The three competing alternatives are all trite, failed forms which are a dead end in view of the exigencies of our time. Let's take the welfare state, the most innocuous, the most desirable, it seems, of the three options, or at least the most easily attainable. The celebrated formula of inclusive affluence was achieved through intensive production and consumption, which incurred the terrible environmental trauma we are trying to cure now. So this is no way to go if we're serious about managing the ecological crisis. The two more radical alternatives, the idea of socialism on the left and illiberal democracy on the right, these two ideas are lacking the generative power to uproot and replace neoliberal capitalism. On the one hand, the unfortunate experiments in East and Central Europe with autocratic socialism, with state socialism, deprive the idea of socialism of much of its appeal. I think this appeal, even if the popularity is coming back, it doesn't have the pulling power to mobilize social energy sufficiently to push ahead. On the other hand, as the example of China has displayed, the collective ownership of the means of production as the key feature of socialism does not prevent a company or a state to behave like a capitalist entity in the global economy. That is, to pursue profit with all the nefarious, the negative impact that this has on individuals, their communities, and the environment. Thus, models that are now fashionable, they are celebrated as being radical and progressive. Typically, such model is Thomas Piketty's so-called participatory socialism. I think it's a representative of what the progressive, the self-identified progressive forces endorse. So this formula calls for a significant equalizing redistribution of resources, of wealth, and worker participation in company boards. They lack emancipatory power we currently need exactly for the reasons I just stated. As to illiberal democracy or autocratic capitalism, no need to dwell much on it there. The features of that are spreading everywhere, not only in East and Central Europe, also in Western Europe, in America. This model neither represents a sufficiently radical alternative to neoliberal capitalism. It is rather compatible with it, or pretty well compatible with it, nor does it have the captivating power to mobilize for the kind of shift we need. So we seem to be stuck. The acute need for radical transformation is not matched by novel projects. And there are two reasons for us being stuck. The first has to do with our political economy. The other with our habits of mind, with our intellectual logistics. The two things are related. To solve successfully the question, what is to be done, we need to decide what is doable. But what is doable is very much a matter of what is thinkable. Fixing the political economy is the job of politicians. Fixing the intellectual logistics, that's our job, the job of academics, and especially of theorists like we all here. Even if we don't have the power to alter policy, we have the power to make thinkable that which needs to be done. So the shift begins with us. Let us now look together at the first point of what is blocking, transformative change. Let's look at the political economy of European societies. There has been much talk, at least since the financial crisis of 2008, that capitalism is in crisis. While pundits, academics, journalists, specialists have been discussing the impending demise of capitalism, neoliberal capitalism, I have claimed in my latest book, Capitalism on Edge, neoliberal capitalism not only did very well economically, but also has quietly transformed itself into a new form, which I have described or named precarity capitalism. Now, precarity capitalism rides on the tails of the neoliberal form that dominated the late 20th century, the 80s and 90s. But about the turn of the century, capitalism acquired new characteristics. One such shift concerned the key policy priority. Competitiveness, rather than competition, became the top economic priority. Now, to achieve national competitiveness in the global economy, governments not only deregulated labor markets and production processes and privatized public assets, they were doing that very joyfully under neoliberal capitalism, but they also began actively to support the most powerful economic players, those which already had advantage in the global economy, in order to, to secure the national competitiveness in the global economy. And in this way, the governments went against one of the core tenets of capitalism, competition. So this amounted to an active state intervention to maximize the advantages big corporations already had in the global economy. So the states, in fact, used the distributive apparatus, the distributive know-how they had acquired during the welfare state, but they did the redistribution in the opposite direction, from weak to the strong, from society to the big economic players. At the same time, digitalization and automation eliminated many jobs and allowed some jobs to relocate to places with cheaper labor. As a result of all of this and many other factors that I review in the book, the competitive pressures in Western societies, and here I include also the societies of East and Central Europe, these competitive pressures increased on everyone but a handful of big players. This has generated massive precarity, which I define as a politically generated economic insecurity and social vulnerability that harms people's material and psychological welfare, as well as society's capacity to cope with adversity and govern itself. It is rather symptomatic that the word precarity officially entered the English language dictionaries about 10 years ago only. There is a difference between precariousness, the word that existed, or our fragility as mortal beings, and precarity, which is politically generated vulnerability. Judith Butler, the great American philosopher, draws a distinction between, on the one hand, precariousness as a matter of our physical or biological vulnerability, and on the other hand, precarity, which is socially generated vulnerability resulting from social marginalization, poverty, economic insecurity, political disenfranchisement, and or violence. This is according to Butler's approach, distinction between precariousness and precarity. Now, it's important to notice that the opposite of precarity is not safety, it's not security or stability, but empowerment. So let me explain that point because I find that's very important. The word precarity has its origin in the Latin precarious, which means obtained by entreaty through prayer, prayer to God, or through begging. So something given as a favor, depending on the pleasure or mercy or the goodwill of others. Therefore, the core feature of precarity is powerlessness. It literally means depending on the will of another. This is the worst form of insecurity, in fact. To quote from the Greek historian Herodotus, of all men's miseries, the bitterest is this, to know so much and to have control over nothing. Think about COVID. The most affluent, scientifically advanced societies have had such difficulty coping with a virus that was neither completely unknown nor too deadly. It is because this pandemic was sitting or prepared by another one, epidemic of precarity. For a while in political theory, the condition of precarity was a term reserved to describe the lot of the worst off. The British sociologist Guy Standing coined the term the precariat, exactly, akin to the proletariat, to describe workers on temporary and poorly paid jobs. Judith Butler also conditions precarity on inequality and exclusion. But in my work, I speak about the massification of precarity as the key feature of our contemporary capitalism and the greatest social the great social evil of our times. The illness has spread, affecting almost everyone, irrespectively of skills and income levels. Now, for my book, I looked at surveys of millionaires in the US. Above 80% of them were saying that they live in permanent fear of losing it all, that they work more and work harder than they would normally prefer out of insecurity and, the insecurity of losing their livelihood. Now, it is important to recognize this condition in order to be able then to proceed to identify the triggers of that social condition. So I believe that precarity and not inequality, as we are so often told, is what currently ails the 99%, what worries the multitude. Because of the increased competitive pressures for fewer and fewer good jobs, our livelihoods have become insecure. At the same time, that's also an important contributing factor, we cannot rely on quality public services or the capacity of even affluent states to act effectively in the public interest, ergo the COVID pandemic. But think about it, no matter how egalitarian our societies become through redistribution, or how rich we become individually, we as individuals would never be rich enough to secure for ourselves quality health care, as this requires enormous resources to be invested, not just in medical provision, but in research, in public education, etc. That is why I believe the obsession of self-appointed progressive forces with inequality, much as inequality is a harm, but the exclusive focus on inequality is short-sighted. Making inequality the centerpiece of the social justice debate is not only petit bourgeois, if we ask Marx. And we might recall Karl Marx's objection to equality as a value. It is famous, but even worse, the obsession with inequality is part of the new liberal governmentality. It engages thinking in terms of comparisons between individuals or groups. So why is this flawed? What is wrong with this? As the American philosopher Harry Frankfurt remarked, the poor, in his book called Inequality, the poor suffer because they don't have enough, not because others have more and some far too much. Second, thinking in terms of comparisons between individuals and groups obscures the social dimension, the collective dimension, the commons. As I said, our societies might become relatively egalitarian like the socialist countries were, or even completely equal, but still affected by poverty and precarity. So there is some logical flaw there in the focus on inequality as the ultimate injustice. So when we make inequality the centerpiece of the social justice agenda, we fall into a fallacy I have called the paradox of emancipation. As we fight for equality and inclusion, we actually increase the value of the deeply unjust social system within which we struggle to be included and equal, right? Any club that we want to be included in becomes more valuable to us. So in a word, to be equally precarious is hardly much of a progress. So this is my appeal, is to retain mercilessly our focus on the massification of precarity as the scourge of our time. Now, 1989 was such a contributing factor to this state of affairs. It exacerbated precarity on both sides of the Iron Curtain. The post-communist societies demolished the robust social safety nets people had been used to. Many of these societies fell in the hands of oligarchic mafia, like Bulgaria. In a word, people suddenly found themselves within a new socio-political context they did not know how to navigate, and they were poorly equipped to navigate. They felt disempowered, precarious. For Western Europe, the Eastern enlargement of the EU brought globalization, or kind of neoliberal globalization, right at the heart of Europe. So that deepened existing anxieties related to labor market liberalization that had started already before the enlargement, of course. You might remember during the 2005 referendums on the Constitutional Treaty for Europe, both the French left and the right used the imagery of the Polish plumber who was allegedly threatening to take away manual jobs from the French workers of the old member states. And they use that image, that threat, that scare to lobby successfully for a no vote on the Constitution of Europe. And that was one of the founding members of the EU. So as fear of job loss, of job outsourcing has become shared across the working and the middle classes, negative attitudes to the Eastern enlargement increased. The first EU-wide deliberative poll in 2007, on which I have also published, established that when issues of social policy and EU enlargement were discussed together, negative attitudes to enlargement significantly increased. I'm going to move now to the political fallout of precarity. So I covered a little bit the political economy of precarity, but the political implications are very grave. They're dreadful, in fact. Insecurity does not create revolutionaries. Insecurity and the quest for certainty, the quest for safety, makes people conservative, even reactionary. It breeds reactionary instincts as people long for safety and security and embrace political shortcuts to safety, from opposing immigration to supporting autocratic leaders that are promising, the immediate delivery of security. And this is equally true for Western Europe as for East and Central Europe. We see these autocratic policies now in France, in old member states such as France, Austria, Spain. So economic precarity and political autocracy go hand in hand. Precarity, so another political offshoot of that, is that precarity has altered the ideological map of Europe away from the traditional left-right axis of orientation that has been with us at least for 200 years, into something I've described as a risk opportunity poles of the clustering of public preferences and the political supply to these demands. So the political debate throughout Europe around very, very distinctively around the turn of the century has moved beyond the left-right divide over economic policies along the poles of free enterprise versus redistribution. Campaigns started to center on political and economic insecurity. So I observe the emergence of a new order and safety or anti-precarity agenda with 4 constitutive elements: physical security, political order, cultural estrangements and related anti-immigrant sentiment, and economic insecurity as the economic component of the mix. So we have physical, political, cultural, and economic component. That's a whole agenda of public demand, and parties are trying to adjust to this public demand and abandoning the left-right divide to a new configuration. Note that by combining economic security, the quest for economic security, and physical safety, and cultural purity, this agenda integrates the classic ideological opposition between social justice on the left and law and order and cultural, traditionalism on the right. So precarity capitalism has this other feature, the replacement of the left-right divide with an opportunity-risk cleavage that places in opposition the ever-increasing number of those who feel threatened by the new economy of IT, innovation, and open borders, and those who still can profit from it. Another fallout of precarity, very regrettable development, is that the economic insecurity of the middle class and the upper middle class has eroded its habitual tendency to protect the interest of the poor. So this solidarity that enabled the welfare state, the post-war welfare state, the willingness of the more affluent to shoulder the burden of redistribution, has gone. A similar economic solidarity with the East and Central Europeans enabled the EU enlargement. But this kind of solidarity is now eroded, being almost gone because of the precarity of the middle and upper middle class. Okay, so their political preferences of those strata are shifting to the right or becoming more conservative. So if we look further up in the political class, the precarity of the ruling class has destroyed even their healthy sense of vanity, which has traditionally prompted the privileged to act in the public interest. Insecurity is rather making elites focus on personal enrichment. Notice the eruption of corruption and embezzlement scandals, not only in countries like Bulgaria and Romania, but as Germany and France over the past 30 years. That at the risk of public humiliation. I remember the scandal in the UK Parliament now 20 years ago. The embezzlement of funds. So what has happened meanwhile with the crisis of capitalism that was supposed to foster our radical transformation? The crisis of capitalism is nowhere to be seen. Instead, we have a situation that I have described as a meta-crisis, the crisis within the crisis. The very crisis has entered its own crisis. The sense of anxiety persists, but it has become a permanent condition. Note, however, that the crisis is an episodic moment in an entity's existence with three possible outcomes: death, return to normal health, to good health, or radical transformation. Instead of that, we are in a fourth option, permanent, stasis, permanent inflammation, sense of anxiety, like perpetual low fever. And we don't know how to get ourselves out of that. Chronic inflammation. We feel that something is deeply wrong, that something is amiss, but we don't have the mental energy, the will, the know-how to get unstuck. To quote from the maverick social theorist David Graeber, today's times are governed by the assembly of a, I quote, giant machine designed first and foremost to destroy any sense of possible alternative futures. This sense of being stuck is a feature of precarity whose essence, let us recall, is not so much insecurity, but powerlessness, which deprives us of a sense of agency. Now, with this, one of the preconditions of transformative, emancipatory change is conspicuously lacking or missing. Such a change requires two things: an acute sense of injustice, of something being deeply wrong, and we have plenty of that. But also what is needed is a sense of agency. And this is what we are currently lacking because of the epidemic of precarity that has affected even the affluent liberal democracies. This condition of meta-crisis, or crisis of the crisis, has affected also social criticism and intellectual critique. And this is the next point I'm going to address, because this is our task the next 2 days. This is what we need to sort out. We are captive of a few dangerous cliches, of easy ideological certainties. One such cliche is the belief that the horizon of possible social models is demarcated by the choice between capitalism, socialism, or some mix of the two. Hence the renewed enthusiasm for socialism or the rush to reinvent the post-war welfare state. But I find that the most dangerous, debilitating of our intellectual habits is to see a radical transformation as being conditioned on the availability of three things: crisis, revolution, or utopia. This is such a demanding set of preconditions that it becomes an excuse for inaction. It further disempowers us. Anyway, whether we need a utopia or not, we might discuss that, and I'm sure we will. But I suspect it might be the wrong question to ask, because currently there is no such captivating, empowering utopia. We need to find a way to press ahead with our transformative change without a utopia that illuminates the road ahead. So it's a great difficulty we're facing. But the revolutions of 1989 contained a solution to these difficulties, to all of this that I just described. And they left us two key insights. How much more time do I have, actually? 5 minutes. Okay. So the first element we can recover from the 1989 revolutions is this: socialism is not the best alternative to capitalism. It is not even a genuine alternative to it. Capitalism and socialism, as I noted already, are not that different in their exploitative logics. They both caused, for instance, the environmental trauma. Within my circle of, the dissident circle I belong to, and I'm not saying that this was the case everywhere, I don't know, but within my circle, the Green Movement, Václav Havel's ideas were very popular at the time. And mainly his rejection of both capitalism and socialism as two systems that incarnate the same exploitative, alienating logic. Under state socialism, as under democratic capitalism, Havel noted, people are afflicted by a condition he called samopohyb, not sure if I pronounce it correctly, samopohyb, or self-waste. This malaise is incurred by our submission to, and I quote from the English translation, the irrational momentum of anonymous, impersonal, and inhuman power, the power of ideologies, systems, apparatus, bureaucracy, artificial languages, and political slogans. This is even more true today. If we are serious about fighting the ecological crisis, we cannot return to the socialist regimes if socialism is understood as public ownership of the means of production. As I said, in the context of global market competition, socialist countries behave like capitalists. Companies owned by the workers behave like capitalists. So it is essential that we free ourselves of the facile capitalism versus socialism dichotomy, including efforts to combine the two, have the cake and eat it, in our efforts to find an alternative to neoliberal capitalism. So I propose radical social change begins with the admission that socialism is a poor alternative to capitalism and that we can do better than that. The second valuable idea of 1989 has to do with the method of intellectual critique and social criticism, which brings me to the matter of utopia. The 1989 revolution was not, or revolutions, because they were different in different corners of East and Central Europe, but they were not driven by a grand utopia, but rather by a non-ideal, negativistic conception of emancipation from oppression, one aspiring to diminish suffering rather than to obtain the just society, what Amy Allen has aptly called emancipation without utopia. In my recollection, for quite a while, at least during the decade prior to the 89 upheavals, my youth, the socialist societies lived with a sense that something was deeply wrong, something was amiss. There was a plethora, multitude of grievances of injustice, from the privileges of the top party elites, political oppression, lower living standards as compared to the West. However, there was one overarching narrative expressed as this is not normal. I even participated in a sociological study asking, what people understand by that in 88. Thus, what guided our private and public revolts was not a distinct idea of an alternative form of life, but rather an acute sense that this, the everyday experience of living under the so-called socialist regimes, was somehow pathological, abnormal. This is very well captured by Theodor Adorno's idea of negative utopianism. In the famous remark of Adorno in his discussion with Ernst Bloch, even though we do not know what the correct thing would be, we know exactly, to be sure, he said, what the false thing is. That is, we do not need to be certain of what is right in order to know that something is wrong. This sense of abnormality, I distinctly remember, was the powerful driver of progressive action, and that drove us to undertake risks with our futures and even our lives, and the power of that feeling should not be underestimated. Now, critical, and I belong to the school of critical theory with the pedigree of the Frankfurt School. Its aversion to utopian blueprints can be traced back to Marxist preference to seek a given social formation's potential for emancipation as a matter of critique rather than as a matter of articulation, the telos, a distinct direction. Marx offered no detailed account of communism. Now, but for those of us who suspect that the experience of injustice, of something being wrong or amiss, the very capacity to detect that, dialectically contains the notion of the just and the right, and ergo the kernel of utopia, we could turn to Marcuse's notion of utopia as unrealized potentiality. Maybe that is the way to go. Marcuse went beyond Adorno's negative utopianism. For him, potentialities are indicated by the false, but they can be formulated positively. In one of his, unfortunately, he didn't articulate that much. He left that task to us. In one of his essays on Hegel, Marcuse points out that they are feelers of the future in the present. So we need to just articulate these things. Anyway, whether we espouse Adorno's non-teleological approach to emancipation or Marcuse's idea of utopia as unrealized potentiality, it will be equal to maintain what I call ambitious pragmatism. By this, I mean that diagnosing correctly the injustices of a given historical junction, without being stuck in these ideological certainties, the ready answers, and then fighting that injustice is the most powerful way to discover and actuate the unrealized potentialities of the historical context. This is what we did back in the 1980s. Our dreams were what I call shy, return to normality, rejoining Europe, but our pragmatism was ambitious. We did not want to overthrow socialism. We were indeed good communists in that sense. We wanted to cleanse it from its pathologies, the privileges of the apparatchiks, the unfreedoms, the oppression. So I believe that if our revolutions were not hurried or they were not sidetracked by the ready model that we imported from the West, we would have subverted autocratic socialism and transformed it into something else, something better, whose name we did not coin at the time. We did not care to know the name of that alternative. Acting persistently on a problem is a more powerful way to discover and actuate this unrealized potentiality. Now, in my work, I think I should wrap it up. I have plenty more to say, but in my work, I have articulated, a certain kind of a methodology, if you wish, of how to perform that analysis. Because, of course, if we use grievances as an entry point of critique, we should not take these grievances as on their face value. The thing is to take those grievances, especially if they're clashing, contending grievances of injustice, to trace them back to the systemic drivers of that injustice, to dig into the structural and systemic dynamics of these injustices. And this is what actually helped me articulate this diagnosis of precarity capitalism as the current condition. So if we fight in this way, if we conduct our intellectual, endeavors and social criticism, political action in this way, I believe we can subvert the reality of injustice without the crutch of utopia, revolution, or crisis. We don't need to name the future. We still can fight for it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very much. My name is Philip Wolfgang from the Czech Academy of Sciences. There was some discussion with students, especially said already in Irish. In all respects. That's the main thing I was going to say. And I don't have a more questions to ask. When we are talking about on the very fact that activating and honoring for the apparatus is lacking, this also really mentioned this further, and this further, beyond that, well, I kind of noticed in your talk, community called setup, a very deep, which I totally buy into, of the notion of competitiveness. I would be wondering whether you have some kind of an alternative term or a kind of a term that would undermine the notion of competitiveness. I've been thinking about it for quite a while. Maybe you have something like you about that.
Yeah.
Very much, yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Wow. What can I say? Well, thank you. I'm deeply moved. Listening to your question, I should clarify my position on utopias. Actually, it's part of the diagnosis of the present. It is the combination of a lack of utopia and precarity that makes people very conservative. Because if we are in a situation of crisis, of economic crisis, social crisis, and we have a powerful utopia, then we can pull through. But it is the combination that is pushing, energies towards fear of change. So I'm not against utopia. Actually, I think it would be easier if we had. But my thinking is, given that there is no such available utopia, what can we do? Okay. Yes, competitiveness. I mean, competition is great. It depends for what. So what I find is the toxic combination is the competitive production of profit, is the profit motive. Now, I'm not an economist, but I've been digging a little bit into this, and it's very symptomatic that economists are interested in my work. Often they present me as an economist. It means that we theorists are giving economists something that they're lacking. So there's a difference between a society that creates profit as a result of rational investment of its resources. Of course, growth in this way, in environmentally conscious, non-consumerist type of orientation of production, even growth and profit can result of that, of gains. The problem is when economic activity and social investment is motivated by the pursuit of profit. So profit motive, not profit itself, is the problem. That will be my answer for the time being. I need to probably research more.
More answers? Thank you very much. I have a lot that I love to look at. I don't just mention two. First, so the completely different state capitalism and the civil because you mentioned the definition that when there is a public on the direction as a definition of social, but isn't this more? Could it be this definition to the whole because then the distinct how we distinguish the form of data could be some other when the other end of that for state capitalism as well it would be profitable. So to what extent can we call that project that was doing from Europe I don't know if it even wasn't in the
right.
If it changed that plan. And I think you mentioned that in 1989 there wasn't that much focus on utopia, but more on dissatisfaction. Am I right? But in last year, the main slogan of the revolution was through the love, the win. That's like and then the problem scenario I would follow the Czech Republic and still was very useful.
Wonderful questions. Yes, it's very important to establish our categories. Otherwise, it's very confusing. So, state capitalism, socialism. In order exactly to achieve this kind of lucidity, in my work, I talk about, first of all, that these are social systems of social relations with a above all, a constitutive principle. So for the constitutive principle of capitalism is the pursuit of profit, is the competitive production of profit. For socialism, it was not the competitive production of profit. The socialist regimes competed indeed with the West, but not for the production of profit. They competed for, conquering space. Profit was not the motive. So it was a different constitutive principle. Then we have the institutions that structure these relations, institutions through which that constitutive logic is enacted. And in capitalism, this is the private property of the means of production. In socialism, it is a collective property of the means of production. And then we have certain distributive outcomes as a result of these things working their logic. So in capitalism, you have typically inequality. In socialism, you have, more of a, I wouldn't call solidaristic, because our societies, I don't recall them being very solidaristic. People were pretty nasty to each other. But there were more egalitarian distributive outcomes. So if we use this kind of conceptual scheme, state capitalism, like, let's say, China, would be different from socialism. I wouldn't call that socialism, exactly because China is almost exclusively driven by the pursuit of profit in the global economy, right? They're not conquering space. They're not, investing in other type of distinction of their society. There is very much export-oriented growth through the pursuit of profit. Oh, the utopian energies of 89. As I said, the one thing that became clear after the fall of the Soviet regimes was how different these societies were. There is not one story. There are many stories. I present what I experienced from me, and I do not claim that this is the whole story. We need to collect those stories, in fact. In Bulgaria also, there was a lot of talk about the truth. We built the city of the truth. But when you want truth, that implies that you're fighting a lie. And that is the negative utopianism that was driving us. I remember that. So we blocked the university, and the television came and said, well, if you tell us what you want, we're going to air it on television, so it might have some impact. And then we sat down. Well, what do we really want? We actually were very frustrated. We want the truth, but what do we want really? So when we were forced to pin down what we wanted, we actually came up with things. But that was not necessary for our revolt. Yeah. 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 Right. Thank you, Petra. Let me start with the last one. I mean, academic precarity is debilitating. That's why it's important that we actually, fight for employment stability for everybody in academia, because it makes us pliant, it makes us submissive. Peter Fleming has written a great book on how academia dies. It just came out. I participated in the launch. Now, about the individual sources of resistance, I am cautious of not putting too much pressure on individuals for the following reason. Now, what has happened with neoliberal capitalism, and this, of course, is a tendency within capitalism, so it's not just the neoliberal form, but as more responsibility is being put to individuals, often in the name of democracy, we have a very interesting configuration. So individuals have responsibility without power, and public authority has power without responsibility. So actually, we need to do something to balance that, and that's why I talk about empowerment rather than freedoms for individuals to act. So we need to equip people to become agents. How do we do that? Well, I see economic stability as a precondition. It doesn't have a value in itself, and we're not talking about affluence. If you notice, even the radical left in America is promising unprecedented prosperity. No, we need to drop that. What people need is economic stability rather than affluence. So I think they would be ready to make that trade-off. And I think this is also how we reconcile the green agenda with the social justice agenda. As long as we are piling up, growing the cake and redistributing it, we would never manage to save the environment. But switch from, equality and redistribution talk to stability and economic and social safety, then people might endorse the green agenda. So I think this is the way I would reason also. And in my book, I make a big deal out of the opportunity to work less. So while nowadays it's very fashionable to talk about universal basic income or job guarantee, I think I'm not a fan of either. Because, again, David Graeber, the bullshit jobs, we don't need the bullshit jobs. We don't need to go back into this, everybody has to work. But it is not the right time. Where are we going to find the means for the universal basic income? What was it? Piketty has proposed everybody, when we hit 21, we get 200,000 euro. Well, all right, good luck with that. So there is an alternative, and this is job sharing. So our societies, at least, the affluent West, but generally technologically, we have the know-how to produce the essentials of life with very little labor input. The problem is that this is poorly distributed. So the labor market insiders, they work their lives away. Those with good jobs, they cling on, they work more than they desire, while the labor market outsiders, they can never get into the labor market. So there are things to do to capture this decommodification potential, what I describe in the book as a decommodification potential of our times, through policies. It's very unglamorous, unfortunately. These things.
My question might sound critical, but it's meant as a it's skeptical whether the notion of the canon really can transcend the left and right and why. Very good. But I think you mentioned the skeptic and the label of security, sustainability, and safety.
Yeah.
Second sub-question.
Equality.
The relation between equality and equality. Because I think that we need the necessary condition for character. My underlying concern is for pragmatism, however, ambitious maybe something unpolitical.
Unpolitical.
There's too much more giving in to the status quo, how we are.
Okay. Wonderful.
Okay, so my name is Alison. I'm from the University of Prague. This free market products. So, of course, the speaker will be expressed in this yes, but nobody will be wanted. And we have to speak in terms of gaining sense of justice and empathy. So, we need to see care and the sense of justice and sense of empathy. And these and they have people who are not
Wonderful. Difficult. So whether I'm not, first question about the left and the right and how precarity translates in that. I'm not advocating that we abandon the left and the right. It's a diagnosis. I'm only saying that the quest for economic safety, which has been a staple of the left, is now combined with anti-immigrant sentiment, with quest for cultural stability. So the elements combine in the public demand, because in electoral politics and mobilizations, you always have clustering of public preferences to which parties reply. This is what I'm tracing that no longer makes sense. You cannot really describe these, the so-called populist movements. You cannot label them very easily as left or right because of this combination of elements. And I think that actually the pandemic has deepened that switch from left-right to opportunity risk. We still use the labels because we're used to them, but the labels are confusing, I find, or inadequate. Equality and precarity. I love that question. You put it very well. It's maybe necessary but insufficient. I might agree with that, but I might still say that, I mean, is it really necessary? I mean, even Marx, in the Gotha critique of the Gotha program, you know, the way he described communism is to everybody according to, from everybody according to their capacity to everybody according to their need. This is not equality. And he had some very bad things actually to say about equality, economic equality even, not just equality, liberal equality before the law. So it is worth examining that question, and we can take it up later. But I think that the problem is really not in inequality. Now, if we are concerned with poverty, and I think we should be, this should be our concern, with precarity and poverty, we need to ask, in the economic system that we inhabit nowadays, does the lot of those worst of, the poor, depend on the richer getting richer? If that's the economic engine that provides for their, decent living standards, we cannot touch that unless we're ready to replace it with something else that gives different distributive outcomes, but also does not impoverish the poor further. So I'm proposing to think about affluence not in as a good to be distributed, but rather as a process of economic production, and then see what happens. And then I think we would conclude that inequality, as long as it provides secure and decent living, is not the problem. To be debated indeed. That my project is unpolitical, that I endorse the status quo. That's the biggest challenge. So my analysis of capitalism runs along three trajectories, right? The distributive, then the structural, what are the structuring institutions, and then the systemic dynamics. I think that progressive and radical, progressive politics should run along the three of them. So we should fight inequality and exclusion. We should fight the, or at least question the structuring institutions. But most importantly, we should fight these systemic dynamics of competitive profit production. I reserve the term radical only for the last. The others are emancipatory, but they're not radical. Now, if we consistently fight precarity, means to fight the profit motive. This is a serious business. This is not apolitical. This is not endorsing the status quo. The negative utopia and the positive utopia. So my two conditions are a sense of acute sense of injustice, not a notion of justice, but injustice. We were really driven by a sense that this is just so unbearable. We need to do something about it. That is why I could not withdraw my signature from that committee. You do not withdraw your signature from your ecological cause. It's just beyond thinkable. So that was a very powerful motivating factor. I think we need to recover that. Whether we have positive utopias, that's fine. my fear is that if we're focusing too much on the elaboration of a positive project, we might alienate some people, and any idea is only as strong as the social force behind it. We need to mobilize currently. I mean, I don't have a ready formula for all times. My analysis is contextual. It is focused on the contemporary Western societies. So what I mean to say that in the current moment, we need to mobilize the multitude to fight the profit motive. The utopia might be in the way of that. If it is cutting social alliances, if it is eroding the social alliances, it would not be doing its emancipatory job. So I'm not in principle against, but it needs to be a utopia that can unite the multitude against, the profit motive.
Okay, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Good luck. Let's enjoy the conference.